When I was a kid, my parents read to me a version of Cinderella where the stepsisters cut off part of their feet just to fit into her shoes. And later during Cinderella's wedding, the pigeons pick out their eyes. You've probably guessed it by now, I grew up in a German-speaking country, and the fairy tales I heard in my childhood were not the ones that you see in Disney movies. They were the ones where the villain has to dance in hot iron shoes until she dies, where a severed horse's head becomes the best friend of a princess, and where a little mermaid turns into foam because she's not being seen. Growing up, these fairy tales have influenced me greatly, and I find that they also impact the way I see and write dark fantasy. So I've gone over a few of them and extracted the elements that can help you and myself write even darker and more atmospheric fantasy stories. The Goose Girl is a story of betrayal. A story of a princess who is betrayed by her own maid and forced to trade places. Tragic thing is that everyone around them believes the maid. There's only one creature in her new home that trusts her and that believes her, and that is her faithful horse. This horse is dead, and its severed head is nailed above a gate. Yet this horse still speaks to her and becomes sort of a mother replacement, a mentor who guides her and helps her in her difficult situation. Even dead, her horse is more loyal to her than anybody else. This story is not about something horrific or grim that haunts the heroine. It's about what is absent. There are no allies, no friends, nobody that she can rely on except for this uncanny being, her dead horse. And that makes her isolation feel even worse. While, of course, the classical protagonists strongly rely on their allies and friends to win, it is a great way to make a story seem darker and heavier by taking away the support system of the heroine or the hero. Or, of course, you can do it as in The Goose Girl and give them scary or uncanny allies that bring even much more dark atmosphere to your story. You probably know the story of the Little Mermaid from the Disney movie, but I'm talking about the original fairy tale, and this is quite different. So the Little Mermaid gives up her voice just to be noticed by the prince. She grows human feet, and every step on land hurts her as if she was walking on knives. She does everything that's asked from her, and yet the prince doesn't choose her. He does not want to marry her. He picks another woman. And she even has the chance to kill him and thus save herself, but she decides not to. So the real ending of the fairy tale is quite a sad one. She dissolves into sea foam and essentially dies. When I was a child, this ending really broke my heart. But still, I find it much more memorable than the pink Disney version. Honestly, it makes much more sense because the sacrifice is real. She decided to give up her voice, which is, of course, very metaphorical. And she does this just to please somebody, and as a consequence, the prince doesn't pick her, the mermaid who gave up her identity and who basically erased herself. Consequence is one thing that many dark fantasy stories still struggle with. And one of the reasons why Game of Thrones is so insanely popular, because the consequences are real. And many authors would like to make them reversible and not let their characters die or suffer in the end. But somehow it does feel like cheating the story. So writing good dark fantasy can mean to let characters suffer the consequences of their actions without creating some artificial actions or sending someone in to save them in the last minute. This creates also much more interesting protagonists because the consequences will then change them forever. They're irreversible and they make them into stronger characters who have a story, if they're still alive, of course. Now, as a sane and responsible adult, you would probably think that these fairy tales are not for children because they're too gory and the endings are just too horrific, honestly. But when I heard them as a child, let's talk about Snow White. The evil stepmother has to dance in hot iron shoes until she drops dead. Or Cinderella, the girls, the stepsisters, get their eyes pecked out as a punishment for their cruel behavior. I wasn't really shocked as a child because these punishments seemed such a logical consequence to those characters' behavior. Nowadays, it's quite popular to offer a redemption arc to a villain, but if you're writing dark fantasy, poetic justice could be even more satisfying. Just think of probably the most horrific character to have ever been written, Joffrey Baratheon, when he chokes and dies in his own wedding, Now, of course, you don't have to make it so brutal and horrific. What matters is really that the punishment is tailored to the villain and feels like a logical consequence of their action. Not all readers can handle this kind of harsh ending, but when it comes to dark fantasy, it's not really for the faint of heart anyways. So you don't need to soften the ending necessarily and force a redemption arc, because not every character does need to be redeemed or even deserves redemption. Isolation, consequence, and justice, these are just free elements that you can take from fairy tales and transport to your own dark fantasy writing. Of course, there's more interesting elements in those stories to work with. These three are the ones that I like to work with in my own writing. Now, I would love to know which one is your favorite gory fairy tale. Let me know in the comments. I generally want to know which stories you cannot forget about. If you've stayed all the way until the end of the video, I might as well introduce myself. I'm Effi, I'm a dark fantasy writer with a literature degree, and I love creating worlds to escape into. If you are a reader or a writer who loves getting lost in stories, you might feel at home here. See you in the next video.